So for today's video, I'm going to be talking about common Stephen King misconceptions. And from having a Stephen King booktube channel, I've definitely heard a lot of these in the comments section, and a few people in my life that have maybe only read a couple Stephen King books, or maybe they've seen a Stephen King movie or two, but they're largely unfamiliar with Stephen King. They tend to have some of these misconceptions, if not all of these. And basically, I just want to make this video to highlight these misconceptions and to maybe erode some of them, because some of them, while they might have like a grain of truth to them, some of these are just not true, and some of these are just false, or maybe they're, I don't know. But basically, these are just misconceptions that hopefully I can squash a little bit, and hopefully I can convince people that if they're hesitant to read Stephen King because of these things, I can kind of get these people over these misconceptions. And yeah, that's basically what I'm going to do in this video, is just talk about some Stephen King misconceptions that I see and hear about all the time on my Stephen King videos. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So the first one that I hear all the time is that Stephen King only writes horror books. And this has been a common misconception since the 80s, since basically he's been famous, is that, oh yeah, Stephen King just writes those silly horror books, and just his books are always super scary. And funny enough, Stephen King himself has a really funny story about this, of like him going to a grocery store and this old lady kind of stops him and says, "Hey, I know you're Stephen King. You write all of those nasty horror stories. Well, I like true uplifting stuff, like that Shawshank Redemption." And Stephen King's like, "I wrote that, right?" And she's like, "No, you didn't." Well, he did in different seasons. It's definitely a great example of Stephen King not writing horror. Maybe some of these novellas could be horror leaning, but like definitely the Shawshank Redemption is just not a horror book, and it's definitely one of the greatest stories ever told in my mind. Also a great movie. So this one, and there's countless others, but I'll just give some famous examples. The Green Mile. A lot of people are wowed when they realize that The Green Mile is a Stephen King book and Stephen King adaptation. Definitely not horror. And definitely a newer one that a lot of people seem to love is 11/22/63. Also definitely not horror. And then him writing more of a mystery and thriller kind of deal is Mr. Mercedes, which I would also not classify as horror. So if you're not reading Stephen King because you think that he only writes horror, he definitely does not only write horror. He has countless examples of books that I would personally not consider horror, maybe even closer just to thriller or suspense. But yeah, there are lots of examples. Another thing that I hear all the time is that, oh, Stephen King writes all those long books. I get this all the time, which, his most popular novels are It and The Stand. So it makes sense. Or like, oh, if they look at that at the bookstore, like, oh, all of his books just must be 1,000-page tomes, right? Those two are, admittedly, but he has, like I said, a ton of great short books. A lot of them are classics, like Cujo, only 300 pages, Thinner, only 300 pages, Misery, only 300 pages, Carrie, his first published novel, only 200 some pages, and of course he has a bunch of short story collections, and he has novella collections that sometimes get published individually as novellas. And he just has a ton of short books. And I would argue that a lot of his best books tend to be on the shorter side. So definitely check out his catalog and his bibliography. Some of them are definitely longer, but he definitely has a wide range of page count books. And a lot of his best ones, like I've said, tend to be on the shorter side. And this next misconception definitely comes from what seems to be older fans of Stephen King, maybe fans that have read a lot of his older stuff and maybe they didn't get along with a couple of his newer ones. So basically their claim is that new King sucks and that old King is much better than new King. And for me, I definitely disagree, although he definitely has a lot of classics that were written in the 70s, in the 80s. I think both. He has great books and bad books in every decade that he's written in. So obviously the 70s, you've got great books like The Shining and Salem's Lot and Carrie, and my personal favorite, The Dead Zone. but you've also got Rage, which I think is one of his worst books. And then in the 80s, again, you've got classics like It and Misery and Pet Sematary. But you've also got bad books, in my opinion, in the Tommyknockers and the Talisman. And then in the 90s, where a lot of people might cite him as being on the downward spiral of writing great books, he's got Needful Things, which is one of my personal favorites. Dolores Claiborne, another fantastic book. My main point is that he's got great books and bad books in every decade. And especially in the 2000s, which a lot of people seem to be, it seems to be a lot of people's least favorite Stephen King decades. It's basically everything after 2000, which I think is malarkey, because Doohickey, one of his all-time best novels, written in the late 2000s, Revival, here it is, I think it was 2014, so good. If you're an old Stephen King fan and you haven't read this one, definitely check it out. It'll knock your socks off. And then also something like Billy Summers, which was released, I don't know, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. Great book. So I definitely disagree. New King does not suck. I think New King is maybe just written a bit differently. But my main point is that Old King has great books, but also has bad books. New King might have some duds, but New King is also great. Another common misconception or kind of complaint that I hear a lot is that Stephen King movies are always worse than the book, or that they're not even worth watching, which I can kind of get a little bit, because he just has so many adaptations that it's kind of a joke at this point. I think he is the most adapted author of all time. Almost all of his books have been adapted in some fashion or form or whatever, and a lot of them are admittedly bad, but there's a lot of them that are great, that are faithful adaptations, or they're just definitely worth watching. Kind of a controversial one is The Shining, which that kind of divides fans. But if we're even looking past that, speaking of different seasons, you've got The Shawshank Redemption, which is incredibly faithful adaptation. You've got Misery, one of the best performances from Kathy Bates. Dolores Claiborne, also Kathy Bates. You've got Gerald's Game, which is a newer adaptation, which is fantastic. You've got the newer It adaptations, specifically the first one. The second one, maybe not so much. But there's so many great Stephen King adaptations. Green Mile, I don't know if I mentioned that already. But yeah, there's tons of great ones. And admittedly, there are some bad ones, but that doesn't discount that there are also a lot of great Stephen King adaptations that are definitely worth watching. And another Stephen King misconception and complaint that I hear a lot on my channel is that his endings are always bad. And admittedly, he does have some bad endings. I point to stuff like The Stand, which one of the worst endings in my opinion. Also, It kind of has a weird thing at the end that a lot of people dislike. Under the Dome, I cite as being his worst ending of all time. But overall, I think that mostly his endings are good. Maybe not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but a lot of the times they end up being pretty good. Some examples for me, at least, Firestarter has a fantastic ending, and obviously I'm not going to spoil it. And then obviously The Dead Zone, my all-time personal favorite Stephen King book, I think has a fantastic ending as well. And maybe quite possibly one of the best endings to a series of all time is The Dark Tower. The very ending to his, magnum opus fantasy series, fantastic ending. So this notion that Stephen King just always has a bad ending kind of gets on my nerves, because usually the people who say that have not read all of his books or even most of them. A lot of his endings are either pretty good or very good, in my opinion. This next one is kind of just more of a silly misconception, which, maybe if you haven't read a lot of Stephen King, this could kind of feel like that. But a lot of people think oh, all of his characters just must be writers, which, a lot of his most famous ones are writers. You've obviously got Jack Torrance from The Shining. You've got Paul Sheldon from Misery. And he's got writers in other things like Secret Window, Secret Garden, Bag of Bones. And even in some of his newer ones, you've got Billy Summers, kind of a writer character. But overall, definitely a misconception. I would say most of his characters are not writers. Also, in a lot of his books, he has multiple perspectives, so maybe one of them is a writer, but the other characters are not. An example of this would be It. Like, you have the Losers Club where one of the characters happens to be a writer, but the other 6 or 7 are definitely not writers. They have other professions. So obviously this is a silly misconception because most of Stephen King's characters are not writers. This next misconception really grinds my gears because I get people all the time either saying this or asking me personally about this. Basically, the misconception is that there's a ton of books you have to read in order to really appreciate and understand the Dark Tower series. If you don't know, Stephen King's magnum opus is the Dark Tower series, 8 books. And if you also don't know, Stephen King tends to hide a lot of Easter eggs in a lot of his other novels that definitely kind of connect them either loosely or strongly to the Dark Tower series. Most of the time, I would argue that they are just little Easter eggs, and you definitely don't have to read those books in order to fully appreciate the Dark Tower series. I personally had one of my best friends of all time read the Dark Tower series, and I think at most he had read like one previous Stephen King book. But he read The Dark Tower in its entirety without reading any of these so-called requirements for The Dark Tower, and he thoroughly enjoyed the series without having to read books like Insomnia, Salem's Lot, The Stand, It, all these other books that a lot of people say like, oh, you have to read this and you have to read it in this certain order. And it's like that guy from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Like, oh, these dots connect. It's like, you really don't have to go that far. For me personally, the only book that I do suggest to read before reading Dark Tower Book 5, Wolves of the Kala, is Salem's Lot. That one is definitely the hardest connect because Wolves of the Kala has a character from Salem's Lot, and it definitely spoils Salem's Lot, like the whole book and the ending. So that's one that I would suggest. But other than that, you've got books that you could read, but you definitely don't have to. So yeah, if you're at all scared of starting the Dark Tower series, thinking that you're going to have to read all these 20 or 30 other books that are hard connects, you really don't have to. Just read the Dark Tower series. It's great. This next one, maybe it's not a misconception, but I definitely hear people say a lot that Richard Bachman books aren't as good as Stephen King books, or they're not even worth reading at all, which I think is pretty crazy. If you don't know, Richard Bachman is a pseudonym for Stephen King. Basically, Stephen King was writing so many books in his career, and his publishing house only really wanted to publish one book by him by a year. So he was just like, screw this. I'm doing I'm doing a pseudonym and writing more books. And we got a bunch of Richard Bachman books early on in his career before he was found out as being Richard Bachman. And we got a lot of great Richard Bachman books because of it. I would argue, like The Long Walk and The Running Man and The Regulars and Thinner, even a really not popular one, Road Work, they're definitely all worth reading. It is worth mentioning, however, that Richard Bachman definitely reads a little differently than Stephen King. I would say it's a bit more nihilistic in tone, and the endings, like Stephen King, his endings in his like normal Stephen King books, they can kind of go either way, but I would say most of the time they end in a somewhat hopeful vein, whereas Richard Bachman books are definitely more nihilistic, where the characters almost never have good endings. So definitely be prepared for that. And also a lot of the times with Richard Bachman, they can kind of be more introspective and just character thought experiments. That's definitely what Road Work is, that kind of what The Long Walk is a lot. So they're definitely different, but this notion that Richard Bachman books aren't as good, I mean, you can say that, but to say that they're not worth reading, I think isn't a great thing to say. In my opinion, Richard Bachman is definitely worth reading. I'm going to tread lightly on this next misconception, but basically, this misconception is basically that Stephen King is somehow a racist, a sexist, you name it. Like, he gets a lot of complaints from a lot of people, but my main argument for this is, well, I guess I'll backtrack and say that a lot of people would cite Stephen King as being a racist because he definitely has a lot of racial slurs in his books and just that kind of stuff, especially early on in his career. However, I would argue that a lot of the times when he's using that, he's having the antagonist say that, and you really aren't supposed to like him. And also, if you're at all familiar with Stephen King nowadays, he is definitely a hardcore liberal. He's very liberal minded, and just the notion that he would at all be racist or sexist in any way, it just kind of blows my mind, really. And also, and especially the fact that he's a sexist, like he's written so many great female characters. He has a lot of books that are female led. Like I can't imagine like a sexist being able to write a character like Dolores Claiborne and have her definitely be one of the best characters he's ever written. And just a lot of female Stephen King fans cite Dolores Claiborne as being one of their best and favorite characters of all time. So it just doesn't really make a lot of sense that he would choose to write a female character of that magnitude and have her be so three-dimensional and just so good, and for him to be a sexist. So for me, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm not going to go too much into detail because I don't want to have that kind of discussion, but like I don't think he's a racist and I don't think he's sexist. But yeah, that's just my opinion at least. And the last misconception that I have to talk about kind of harkens back to something I said earlier in the video, but another one that I get a lot is that Stephen King has lost his edge, which I really don't understand either. And this kind of, like I said, it harkens back to the idea that old King is superior to new King. Somehow older King had all of this edge to him, and meanwhile, like his new books just don't have that same edge. And this kind of also harkens back to him being a different writer after he stops using drugs, right? Because a lot of his crazy books came out in the 80s when he was, getting high on cocaine a lot. And then after that, a lot of people say like, oh, he lost his edge. But for me, like I said, if you've read a lot of his newer books like Revival, that book has so much edge to it. Like I don't understand. Also, he wrote a bunch of books in the 70s and 80s that I would argue don't really have a lot of edge necessarily. Like Different Seasons, does it really have a lot of edge to it? I don't know. Like Shawshank Redemption is a great book or a great novella. I don't really think that has a lot of edge to it. The Eyes of the Dragon, like, does that have edge to it, And yeah, I just think it's a silly misconception. I also just personally don't like all or nothing statements, which is why I get kind of irked when I hear some of these misconceptions. Like, oh, Stephen King old books are all fantastic. Everything he wrote after 2000, like after he got off of drugs, after the car accident, it's all shit and it's all not worth reading. I really hate that. So yeah, I don't agree with that. I don't think he had an edge to lose personally. so that one's just kind of funny to me personally. All right, so these were some common Stephen King misconceptions that hopefully I was able to articulate why I don't agree with these. But yeah, definitely let me know what you think down below. What are some Stephen King misconceptions that you have heard of, or maybe that you believed in until you watched this video or until you did some more research? Definitely let me know what you think down below. Also, maybe I said this earlier, but what are some Stephen King misconceptions that you have heard that maybe I didn't talk about in this video specifically? Definitely leave all of that good stuff down below. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. This was fun to talk about. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next Stephen King video. What will that be? I don't know, but we'll find out soon enough. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, give this video a like and subscribe. Bookstore Discord for a bunch of cool stuff there. Patreon and Amazon wish list down below. Thanks for watching and have a fantastic day.